the Christian message is offensive. You know, that's a pretty basic sort of starting point for the gospel, is to say, actually, your heart and mine, it's a hot mess. Like it's actually, we're rotten to the core. It's not just that we sometimes do some bad things, but that actually we're sinners. We need to not fall into this idea that Christian sexual ethics is like actually really bad for people. I think Christianity is extremely good news for all of us, but we won't understand the good news unless we understand the bad news.
Hey friends, Jordan here. Welcome back to the Pastorate. We're glad you've joined us. At some point in your ministry, you'll find yourself in a conversation that you don't feel ready for. And the chances are you already have. These moments don't always come with a warning. They can begin in the church lobby, over a kitchen table, or during a meeting in a coffee shop or office. But no matter where they happen, they often carry this unexpected heaviness. The questions are often personal and nuanced. Pre-packaged answers or general platitudes feel dismissive or out of touch. These kind of conversations expose the limits of our pastoral preparation. They ask for something deeper of us, for pastoral presence, the ability to listen, the ability to discern, and they require of us a profound dependence on the Holy Spirit. They remind us that ministry isn't about having the right information, but it's about being the kind of person who can walk with others through their complexity and tension. I remember a particular season in our church when we were walking through some challenging and sensitive issues. For a week straight, I sat at the same table in a local restaurant as congregant after congregant came in to meet. They brought their stories, their experiences, and their big questions to that table. More than anything, I think they came with a desire to be seen and to be heard, to know that their voice mattered and that somebody would meet them both with care and with honesty in the midst of it all. Those conversations reminded me that pastoring isn't just about what we say from the pulpit. It's about how we show up for our people in the in-between moments. It's not just about offering precise theological answers, but helping people make sense of theology in the context of their real lives, especially in the moments where answers feel unclear, where application is difficult, and where tensions are high. Over the years, I've become more convinced of this, that we need to be both theologically rooted and pastorally equipped. The questions coming to our churches are not getting any simpler. If anything, the cultural and spiritual pressures are growing more and more complex, and as pastors, we can't afford to be unprepared. And that's why I'm so thankful for voices like Rebecca McLaughlin. Rebecca is an author, apologist, and public intellectual, bringing a unique blend of conviction and compassion to the table. She spent years engaging with people, both skeptics and believers alike, on some of the hardest questions facing the church today. Through books like Confronting Christianity, which, by the way, won Christianity Today's 2020 Book of the Year award, The Secular Creed, and Confronting Jesus, she's helped thousands find fresh clarity in the complexity of today's world. In this conversation, Rebecca and I sit down to talk about how Christian sexual ethics fit within the larger biblical story, about how singleness is a vital part of our Christian witness, and how we as pastors can navigate our Western secular cultural moment with both truth and tenderness. Rebecca shares personal stories and practical insights, along with a bold call to see tough conversations not as landmines to avoid, but opportunities to point people to Jesus. Before we jump in, we put together a short listener survey to help us shape the future of the Pastorate podcast and to better serve pastors like you. Your feedback is incredibly valuable to us, and it only takes a few minutes to fill out. You can visit thepastorate.ca/survey or click on the link in the show notes. Finally, here's a quick note from our friends at Generis.
We want to take a quick moment to thank Generis for partnering with us to make today's episode possible. Generis exists to help church leaders like yourself weave a culture of generosity into the fabric of your church. Now, we know any conversation about fundraising can feel awkward or tricky, but they don't have to. Generosity is essential to the mission of God in our churches. And Generis is all about coming alongside pastors to help foster healthy cultures of generosity so our churches can step into the mission God has for us. And here's how they do it. They take the time to understand the unique culture and story of your church. Then they take biblical principles and other proven strategies to build a tailored plan designed for your community. If you want to find out more, we want to introduce you to John Wright from their team. He was a pastor for many years, and now he's giving his time working with Generis and local churches. You can find John's email in the show notes of this episode.
Rebecca, welcome to the Pastorate podcast. It's a joy to have you. Where does the podcast find you today?
It finds me in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the wilds of New England, which is probably closer in some ways culturally, I think, and geographically to Canada than most of the United States.
What's got you rooted in Cambridge?
A wonderful church called Hope Fellowship in Cambridge, which I was just meeting with our pastor this morning, actually, and we were chatting about. I think I've lived here for 16 years. He's lived here for upwards of 20. And I think he was agreeing with me. I don't think I've seen this level of openness to the gospel as much as we're seeing right now. In fact, do you mind if I quickly, I know a lot of your listeners are Canadian. Do you mind if I tell a quick story about a Canadian lady?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
So I had coffee last weekend with a young woman who 2 years ago moved to Cambridge to do a postdoc. She'd grown up in Canada and had been raised in a sort of loosely, or I think significantly actually, Buddhist family. But after moving here, she was just thinking, I don't feel like I have answers to the big questions of life, really. I don't really know what I believe. So she started reading some philosophy and she was like, oh, this is interesting. Still don't quite know. And then one of her lab mates started talking to her about Jesus. And he suggested she read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And so she did. And then he suggested she read The Reason for God by Tim Keller. And so she did. She was like, oh, this makes so much more sense of the world than anything I've read before. And so she started reading the Gospels just this past summer, like a few months ago. And she said, as she read the Gospels, she realized, oh, this is the love that I was looking for. And so literally in the last few weeks, she started coming to our church, started attending Bible study, and it just, seeing someone who demographically, honestly, would not have been in the category of people, most likely to become Christian, like Canadian scientist, postdoc, living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's not your picture postcard, likely convert to Christianity. And here she is.
What an incredible story. I think we're seeing something similar here in Canada, coast to coast, an openness and a sensitivity to the gospel. Even in my home church community in Winnipeg, which is like smack dab in the center of Canada, I can just think of story after story of people who have come to faith who don't really fit your, stereotypical criteria of somebody choosing to turn their life around to follow Jesus. And what a joy. Rebecca, if I'm right, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but you have a PhD in Renaissance literature.
I do. I wish I could correct you because it sounded like fun, but no, it's right.
You might have your moment yet, Rebecca. When I think of Renaissance literature, I'm immediately drawn to Shakespeare. I did my undergrad in Shakespeare, and so I think you and I have some threads to pull there. But take us into that journey. Like, what draws you into Renaissance literature in the first place? And then how does that path eventually lead you into the work that you're doing now, publishing, writing, apologetics?
Yeah, I did my undergrad in English literature in the UK, and then I did a master's and a PhD also on Shakespeare. So I spent 7 years in Cambridge in the UK, going to the same church, playing for the same, what we call football team, what Americans call soccer team. I don't know, do the Canadians say football or soccer?
Yeah, it depends where you're at, but likely soccer.
Okay. The one where you actually kick the ball with your feet a lot, not the one where you throw the ball and then call it football. And studying the same subject for 7 straight years. And throughout that time, I was very involved in a local church there. And one of the big reasons I actually wanted to go, continue in grad school was because there were so many opportunities to talk to people about Jesus. People had come from all over the world to study, and many of them didn't really know many Christians. In fact, a few weeks ago, I had the chance on my podcast to interview a friend who I knew back in the day then. He was not a Christian at all, and subsequently has become a Christian. And it's just joyous to see a sort of dear atheist friend from my graduate school days who now is a very serious follower of Jesus. But yeah, so it was just an opportunity to share the gospel with people. And I then went to seminary because I wanted to learn more. I wanted to be better equipped to teach people about Jesus, and particularly to be involved in a kind of evangelism, apologetics sort of ministry. And I think it's helpful to go to seminary to make sure you're not teaching heresy, which, sometimes with the best will in the world, you can end up saying stuff that isn't true. And I think I've been, in some ways, having the kinds of conversations I'm having now, on a smaller scale for pretty much as long as I can remember, like trying to make a case for Christianity to people who have principled intellectual and or moral reasons for thinking that Christianity couldn't be true.
Yeah, you've spent years kind of immersed in these conversations at the intersection of faith and culture. In your experience, like especially in your church and among your peers, what are the most pressing questions that people are asking about faith and about Christianity now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, and this may or may not resonate with you guys where you are, but in my experience, let's go back 20 years. Mostly the questions that you would hear from people were questions around like, hasn't science disproved Christianity? Or like, how can you say there's only one true religion? Those kinds of questions that sort of spring you often out of like intellectual concerns, or, the Richard Dawkinses of the world, or kind of postmodern views of truth, coming out of English departments. I think so broadly speaking, the people who thought I was foolish for being a Christian, when I was in college, like they mostly just thought I was foolish and deluded. I think today it's the front foot is more the moral questions, and in many people's minds, at least in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I think in England, and I'm pretty sure in Canada, a Christian who, like me, is holding firm to sort of historic Christian beliefs around sexuality and gender is seen as not just like foolish, but actually immoral. Like we sort of move from being pitiable and deluded to being sort of the bad guys in the cultural conversation. So yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I spent quite a bit of my time sort of, when I'm thinking evangelistically and apologetically, actually kind of digging into those questions specifically.
Yeah, so much of your work, it presents the gospel truth, but at the same time, it's seasoned with grace. And honestly, kudos to you. I watched some of your presentations and just see the way that you communicate and the way that your message resonates with the heart. There's an empathy to it, I think, in your storytelling and the way that you lead with story to draw people into conversations. But there's this balance. And I think for a lot of our listeners, there's this age-old grace and truth tension, especially when talking about issues of theology within their local church context. They try to toe this line or find this balance point of like, well, this is the conviction of my church or the conviction of my denomination or even my personal conviction. But here I am engaging with people who maybe don't know Jesus. Well, what are some of the things that you've learned as far as like, yeah, you've presented us this moral conundrum, but how do we lean into that as pastors, saying, we actually have something to say here, and what we have to say is actually good news. Like, how do we navigate, some of those cultural defenses?
Yeah, I think it can be tempting to think, okay, I know that, for example, Christian sexual ethics is like way out of joint with anything that's going on around us culturally, whichever part of the West we're in, most likely. And so knowing that, what I want to do is sort of soft pedal as much as possible and kind of try and accommodate what the Bible's saying to the culture around. Like, I think there's a sort of temptation to say, I really want people to hear the message of Jesus, and all these questions around sexuality and gender feel like they're kind of distractions and roadblocks. And like, if I could just sort of clear them away somehow, and then, maybe we can say, oh, this is just like a agree to disagree kind of issue, and we don't really need to, make any kind of big deal here. I think there's a strong sort of temptation to do that, and often for the sort of good desire of wanting people to know Jesus. I actually think it's precisely the wrong approach. I think instead of trying to sort of accommodate the weird and crazy things that we believe as Christians, because at heart, Christianity is founded on the idea that this first century Jewish man who died on a cross 2,000 years ago rose from the dead 2 days later and is the Lord of all the heavens and the earth. I mean, like, this is craziness, right? This is wild. This is not like, oh, this will fit in nicely with everything everybody's saying around us. And likewise, when it comes to the Bible's teaching of marriage being male-female and exclusive and like one flesh kind of union, what I sometimes say to people is like, Christian sexual ethics is much weirder than you think. It's not actually just that I believe that sex only belongs in marriage between one man and one woman, but I believe this is actually all about a metaphor, this massive biblical metaphor of Jesus's love for his people, Jesus's sort of one flesh union with his church. And I think often in our Christian circles, and I think this is true often amongst Christians who, like me, are sort of trying to stand firm on Christian sexual ethics in the context of a broader culture that is sort of seeing it not only as sort of foolish but also immoral. I think we often lose sight of the gospel message that's at the center of what the Bible is telling us. And so one of the things that I'm often explaining to people, or sort of re-explaining to them if they have heard it at all before, is that if we look at the whole sweep of what the Bible says, we'll see that in the Old Testament there's this recurrent metaphor of God as a loving, faithful husband and Israel as his all too often unfaithful wife. And if you read through the Old Testament, sort of through the Old Testament prophets, you'll find that this marriage is just like continually in crisis. God's people keep cheating on him with the idols, the sort of other so-called gods of their day. And by the end of the Old Testament, one of the big questions is like, how can this loving, holy God live with this unfaithful people? And then Jesus steps onto the stage of human history. And one of the many strange things that Jesus says about himself is he says he's the bridegroom. So, very odd thing for a man to say who never married in his life on earth. So what is he talking about? Well, it's one of the ways he's stepping into the shoes of the creator God of the Old Testament. Jesus is saying, I'm the bridegroom. I come to sort of claim God's people for myself. And we see that then further explored when Paul writes the Ephesians in chapter 5, and he sort of said, like, Christian marriage is like a scale model of Jesus's love for his people. And says even, Paul says that when at the very beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, when we see one man and one woman brought together in a one flesh union, and this kind of, curious comment that Genesis makes, which is, therefore a man will leave his father and his mother and be united to his wife, and they should become one flesh. Paul says, this is a profound mystery, and I'm saying it refers to Christ and the church. So like from the very beginning, when God created human beings and gave us the capacity for sexual relationships, gave us the capacity for marriage, gave it like that, when God built our biology like he did, it was with the intention of Christian marriage pointing to Jesus' love for his people. And that just reframes everything. Because on the one hand, it helps us to see what Christian marriage is about, that it's not a destination, it's a signpost. And I think, sadly, in churches, we've often kind of acted like it's a destination. That's like the pinnacle of human flourishing. And like, if you don't get married, then, that's really unfortunate. Like we sort of have these often actually kind of an idolatry of marriage, taking a good thing and making it, an ultimate thing, which it isn't. But if we put Jesus's love for his people back at the center, that sort of helps us to understand what marriage is really about. It helps us to understand what singleness is about as for followers of Jesus, and how single people can point beautifully to the destination to which marriage is just, a signpost. And it reframes our whole conversation when it comes to why Christians would say no to any sex outside of marriage, and especially to sex between people of the same sex, because it's not actually just about the kind of boundaries that the Bible gives us. It's actually also about this beautiful picture, and it's something. I'll stop yapping in a second, because I know I've got like a massively long answer to one quite concise question. But I was talking last night with our community group, we're studying First Thessalonians together as a church, and we're reading a section of chapter 2 of Paul's letter, the first letter to the Thessalonians, where if you just heard snippets of it, you would think it was a love letter. You know, Paul is talking about them as like his those he loves, his crown, his joy. He's like saying how much he desperately didn't want to be parted from them, and how much he longs to be with them again. Like you could easily like pull many of the phrases out and like put it into the next Disney film with like somebody expressing their like deep desire to be with the person they most love. And Paul is using that language to talk about his brothers and sisters in the church in Thessalonica. And I think to go back to your sort of question about how, like, what does this look like unpacked, I guess, what does it mean today to stand for Christian sexual ethics in a world around us that isn't? I think one of the things it means is rediscovering the New Testament vision for like deep, meaningful, affectionate love between believers, like within the family of God, that we don't have less love to offer than the world around us. We actually have much more, but we sort of lost sight of some of its elements.
Yeah. Like you've unpacked this idea of Christian sexual ethics being situated within the grand biblical narrative as a whole, and how Paul's picking up this one flesh union, saying that this is a mystery and it points to Christ and to his church. But I want to draw on one thread you touched on singleness. I think in many Western church contexts, singleness is perceived as this like incomplete or transitional state, wrongly, I'd say. And I think single pastors really experience this. And it's a sense that's particularly isolating. But how should we be thinking about singleness? Not as like a footnote, but as a vital part of the church's witness in Christian story. How does it fit into, I guess, the grander narrative? Where would you take that?
Yeah, I mean, so many places. So as you mentioned, Paul, who on the one hand says that marriage, like he has such a high view of Christian marriage that he says it is an embodied picture of Jesus's love for his people. Like you don't get a higher view of marriage than that. And he says, as a single person, I wish that you were all as I am. Like he actually seems to hold like singleness in even higher esteem than marriage. And you think, well, you know, how can that be? I think what we see on the pages of the New Testament is number one, we absolutely don't see this kind of collapsing of all like genuine love into the one marriage relationship. We see marriage as like the exclusive and only place for sexual intimacy, and we see marriage sort of having a very particular exclusive design. But for a marriage to be healthy, and for a kind of Christian sort of biological family to be flourishing, that family actually needs to be embedded within the broader family of the local church. And in this sort of metaphor, this picture of Jesus's love for his people, all of us together are Jesus's bride. Whether we're married or whether we're single, like whether we're young or whether we're old, like that's our identity corporately. And if you think about it, that metaphor only works if we are, as the New Testament puts it, one body together as well. So we have these sort of different elements, these sort of different kinds of metaphor, like colliding with each other here. And single people are in a position, I mean, as Paul describes it, one of the things he says is that if somebody is single, they are in a position to have like a wholehearted devotion to the Lord in a unique and particular way, which he seems to prize highly. It's not just like, oh, well, you know, I guess it's okay if you don't get married. Like, it's not like the end of the world, but if you can figure out a way to get married, that would be great. Like Paul doesn't seem to have that view of singleness. He seems to see like value in faithful Christian singleness, just as he sees value in faithful Christian marriage. And I think one of the frameworks that's been really helpful to me as I've thought through these questions is like, we spend so much time fixated on marriage sort of versus singleness, as if this is like a contest and one side needs to win, and where I think there's sort of one stream within the church that is wanting to valorize marriage and frankly denigrate singleness, and there's, I think, another stream in the church which actually kind of is trying to do the opposite of saying, oh no, like we're going to kind of make single, like we want people to take like vows of singleness and to make kind of singleness this almost like a sort of sacramental thing, which I don't think we have any precedent for that in scripture either. It's the way that I think about it is like we're all running together into Jesus's arms in eternity. And some of us currently are in the kind of configuration of having like a particular kind of running mate in marriage, but that doesn't mean we don't need other running mates as well. It's like, you know, we're running as a pack. And some of us currently, and I say both of those currently, not because I think, oh, I might get divorced next week, but because the reality is either my husband or I will die at some point. And so I was single until I was 27, and I may well be single from the ages of, 70 to 90, who can say? Likewise, someone might be single now and maybe even to their surprise end up getting married. And so I don't think that they're discrete conditions that we live in, but they're also, we sort of, I think, spend too much time like playing off one against the other. If we're all running toward eternity together, and the question for us is like, how can we best serve Jesus now? For some of us, that may be as married people. For some of us, that may be as single people. And at the end of the day, I don't think it really matters. Is that okay to say? Like actually, and what I experience, I have a number of single friends who, when I sit down with them and have a big catch up and like hear what's going on in their life and how they're thinking, I come out really rebuked and challenged by their faith. I'm not saying that's true of all of my single friends, and I have some like married friends whose faith is also incredibly challenging to me. But when I see a friend who I'm like, oh, wow, like you're actually embodying exactly what Paul was talking about. And you're using your freedom as a single person to do the kind of ministry that Paul was doing. I think of a friend who's moved to Japan to serve in the growth of the gospel there as a single woman, and just seeing some of the beautiful fruit that's coming out of single people's lives. It's beautiful to see.
Yeah. Thank you for framing the conversation around the image of us running the race together, whether single or married. Yeah, it's a helpful way to reimagine community. It's not a hierarchy of life stages, but it's a unified pursuit of faithfulness. I'd like to pivot slightly, staying within this broader framework though. Personally, some of my own graduate work focused on the pastoral side of Christian sexual ethics. And I've wrestled through some of this stuff deeply in local church ministry as well. Christian sexual ethics aren't a peripheral issue, right? Like they're deeply embedded within the grand narrative of scripture. It's not like an isolated hurdle to get over before somebody encounters Jesus. But getting practical here, and I'd love your insight, for pastors and churches who hold to historic Christian convictions around sexuality and gender, how do we express those beliefs in our church communities, but also, in the public sphere, like in secular contexts here in Canada, those very convictions, they carry a relational cost quite often. And so I guess if you get nitty gritty about it, like, does a church state those beliefs clearly on its website? Is it wiser to allow those conversations to unfold more gradually through things like discipleship and Bible study? How do we preach about these things in a constructive way? I guess in your view, how do pastors hold to theological clarity while exercising pastoral wisdom and how and when we communicate truths like this?
Yeah, I think when it comes to what you put out on your website, I can imagine people coming to different conclusions as to exactly what's the most helpful statements to include, and what you do and don't address, like in a whole range of different areas. And I'm in the enviable position of not being in charge of a church and having to make these difficult sort of decisions. I think what I would say pastorally on the ground, though, is that the Christian message is offensive. I mean, we know that like the gospel is profoundly offensive if you understand it correctly. To say you and I are so sinful that we needed a son of God to come and die for us is really bad news, right? It doesn't fit with anybody's kind of self-esteem, quite frankly. And especially when we say, which Jesus taught, that the desires that come out of our hearts, that even might seemingly naturally come out of our hearts. So for somebody like me, for instance, who, as long as I've had like romantic or sexual feelings, like they were coming out of my heart and directed toward other women. How can we say that the desires of somebody's heart could be like actually wrong and sinful rather than, neutral or like probably good? That's a pretty basic sort of starting point for the gospel, is to say, actually, your heart and mine, it's a hot mess. Like it's actually, we're rotten to the core. It's not just that we sometimes do some bad things, but that actually we're sinners. So I guess I would first say, if Christianity is offensive in our cultural context, we shouldn't be surprised or off-put by that. And second, I would say, I do think there's the area of sexual ethics and sort of, the conversations around gender identity today are perhaps the sort of front foot of where the gospel is offensive. Because there's an extent to which nobody in Cambridge, Massachusetts cares if I believe that Jesus is the only way to God. Like, really, they're like, fine, whatever. Like, if Jesus works for you, like, they might think, well, that's silly and like maybe a bit kind of offensive to people from other religious traditions, but they don't really care. But if I say that your body defines whether you're male or female, and if I say that sex only belongs in marriage between one man and one woman, like that's really offensive. And I don't think that as Christians, we should be setting out to offend people for the sake of the offense at all. In fact, I love what Peter says in 1 Peter when he says, always be ready to give a reason for the hope that you have, but do so with gentleness and respect. I don't think we should be like flame throwing. I think we should be known for our love and for our gentleness and for our respect, and for our love of our enemies, even, in our communities, whatever that looks like. I think if people are coming at us with hostility, we respond with love. But I think having, the offense of the gospel, that sort of rubber hit the road pretty soon in conversations with people who are exploring Christianity, or people who are sort of wondering, what we're about, is actually important and helpful. Because Christianity isn't going to fit in around the edges of their lives. It's not going to affirm what they currently believe about themselves or about anybody else. The true message of the gospel is going to be transformative. And we won't, I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, this young Canadian woman I had the pleasure of having coffee with last week. And I'm just going to read you a little message that she sent me after that, because I'd given her one of my books, Confronting Jesus, just as a like helpful sort of next step to thinking more about Jesus and the Gospels. And she texted me saying, quoting from that book, "But if this is true, I pray that you will find yourself attracted to the light." And she said, "Wow, I was just thinking about my testimony the other day and how I didn't realize I was walking in dark until I found Jesus." She wasn't like roaming around Canada in her like science, like lab coat thinking, "Oh, I'm probably in the darkness. I'm probably like a sinner facing God's judgment." That wasn't how she was thinking about herself. But actually now, as she reflects on it, she's like, oh no, I've gone from darkness to light. And it should be that shocking. Like it's okay if it's that radical. And I think of a number of people in my community here, they get like not really by design, just by happenstance, who previously, dial back a few years and they were in same-sex sexual relationships, and would have like strongly identified with that, and are now faithful followers of Jesus who are very clear on Christian sexual ethics, and are deeply flourishing as human beings. So we need to not fall into this idea that Christian sexual ethics is like actually really bad for people who, like me, experience same-sex attraction. I think Christianity is extremely good news for all of us, but we won't understand the good news unless we understand the bad news.
Yeah, the transformation in some ways is brought about by that initial confrontation with the gospel, right? We're confronted with the truth of the gospel, the claims the gospel makes upon us, and then that process of transformation by the power of the Spirit begins to take root in our lives, evidenced by the story that you're sharing. I love it. Thank you. Talk to us a little bit about what you're working on right now. When you sit down to write, to think, to read, to kind of get after it, what is it that you're chasing down? What is it that you're working on?
Yeah, right now I'm working on a very short book. It's going to be like 10,000 words on the mental and physical health benefits of going to church every week. So there's a whole kind of department at Harvard or a center called the Center for Human Flourishing, led by a guy called Tyler Vanderveel. And he's been looking for years at the relationship between regular religious participation, like going to church once a week or more, and people's mental and physical health outcomes. And it turns out that the impact of regular religious participation is measurably, exceedingly good for us human beings, as far as we can tell, on average. So the reason I'm writing this book is because I feel like the large majority of people have no idea that this is true. And I would love for example, people, secular folk in Canada who are desperate, as are secular folk in the US and in the UK where I come from, desperate for like the latest mental health hack. What is it that's going to help me or my children with our mental health? Like we're grasping, like we'll grab at yoga and meditation and, maybe we eat the right kinds of food, or maybe we like get a dog and walk regularly, or like whatever there's a whole industry around mental and physical wellness. And one of the best things that we can do, it turns out, for our mental and physical health is actually regularly meet for worship with people.
Just go to church. Step one.
Yeah. So the interesting, there are interesting contours of this. One is that it's not, the studies that have been done aren't exclusively on Christianity. So they've been looking at people who maybe go to like a synagogue once a week or whatever as well. But it seems like it is specific to religious gatherings. So just going to like the golf club or the ski resort like once a week and meeting with the same people for the same activity, that doesn't have the same effect. And the sort of social support only accounts for about 30% of the effect, it seems. So it's something kind of, we humans seem to be kind of deeply designed to be in worshiping communities, which, make of that what you will. And so my little book will have a chapter on the mental health benefits, a chapter on the physical health benefits, and a chapter on the spiritual health benefits. Because at the end of the day, Jesus is the great physician, and the message of the gospel is not like come to church and you'll be happier, healthier, longer lived. On average, you actually will. But the message of the gospel is Jesus came to die for you. So there'll be a very kind of clear gospel chapter in there too. But I think I'm tired of people in our society today thinking that Christianity is probably bad for you. And I'm heartbroken by the fact that millions of, especially I think younger people today, are grasping at any spiritual straw that they can grab, like whether it's tarot cards or crystals or astrology. In fact, we have 2 people in our community group who've joined within the last year or so who they tried all of that before coming to Jesus. Like none of it worked, but they were looking for something. And we have the words of eternal life. So I want people to come look.
Amazing. When is your release date expected for this?
I actually don't know. I think it'll be sometime next year. I meant to submit the manuscript on the 1st of November. So
that's great. When this episode comes out, we'll make sure to link to the most recent access for your work in the show notes. Rebecca, thank you for your time today. Thank you for serving the Canadian church just through your wisdom and your well thought out responses. It's been a grace and a pleasure to talk with you. We're praying God's best for you as you wrap up this work.
Thanks so much, Jordan. And just a very last word for folks who are in gospel ministry in Canada. The harvest is plentiful. And I think we all need to be ready to just get out there. Like, let's stop being afraid. Let's stop hunkering down and let's reap the harvest that's before us, because I think we're actually ready for a revival in the West.
Rebecca has this way of reminding us that Christian truth isn't just something to defend, but that it's something to delight in. And I trust that you leave this conversation with more than just talking points, but with a bigger vision for what it means to love and lead your community in today's world. If this episode stirred something in you or gave you language to something that you've been wrestling with, we'd love for you to share it with someone. Apart from directly sending someone a link, one of the best ways for you to support the podcast is by giving it a rating on whatever platform you're listening on. One absolute last note for you today, we're looking for a few people to join the Pastorate staff team. If that interests you or someone you know, head on over to thepastorate.ca/careers to learn more. Thanks for listening, and thank you for all the ways that you're serving the church in Canada and beyond. Until next time, grace and peace to you.